Welcome to the Autism Little Learners podcast, Emily. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Honored that you've asked me.
Oh, I can't wait to talk to you today because your Instagram, there's just so much good stuff, so many good tidbits of information. So, first, though, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Of course. Thanks so much. My name's Emily. I'm a speech language pathologist. I've been an SLP at a clinic called Pediatric Therapy Playhouse in Los Angeles for almost 6 years now. I have a pretty diverse caseload. I work with families with kids with various goals from, 1 to middle school, high school age. And I'm also the program director there. So I supervise clinical fellows and lead the clinic's team through meetings and trainings. But lately, I've become so passionate about supporting autistic and neurodivergent children using a neurodiversity affirming approach. And I'm constantly learning. And yeah, I've shared my journey on my Instagram, which has been really fun to do and grow and learn from that as well.
I love that you work with such a wide range of ages because
Yeah.
to see kids kind of across ages like that, you learn so much about like where they're going. Others like clients you might have, you might learn, okay, this kind of looks like the path they're taking.
And I love just been at the same clinic for 6 years. So
Oh.
I've been with some of those kids for that long and seen them grow. So it's a really, yeah, just meaningful and special career. And I
Mhm.
really do love it.
This is kind of gonna blow your mind, but I was like you when I started out. I just all of a sudden got this like, I love my autistic students. And so I focused on that now for 25 years. But my very first kindergartner, I was in the schools, kindergartner, um, he was 5, autistic. I learned so much from him. He is now 30, which is older than you, and he still comes trick or treating at my house every year. So those relationships that you build with being with and seeing kids that long is just priceless.
Wow, 30. Yeah, that is is wild to think about. But it's true. We make these relationships with these families and yeah, they grow, they seem like they grow so fast and it's just a really special thing to be a part of their lives.
I agree 100%. So today I'm going to pick your brain about a variety of different topics because there are things I've seen you talk about on your Instagram. And I think over the years now, there are things I've heard people wondering about, especially now that we are focusing on neurodiversity. Neurodiversity affirming approaches. And that's changed from when I was first a speech language pathologist. And so when it comes to autistic kids and their language, their communication, their learning. That's why I wanted to have a little bit of this, a little bit of that when it comes to the questions. And so the first question I have is around pronoun reversals. And I've seen this my entire career too. So, can you explain what pronoun reversals are and why so many autistic kids exhibit this?
Absolutely. So a pronoun reversal is when an individual mixes up personal pronouns when referring to themselves or others. So an example of this might be saying you instead of I. For I want a cookie, they might say you want a cookie. Or the child may say they or their name when they mean I. So instead of I'm happy, they may say Henry's happy. And there are a few reasons why pronoun reversals are common. We know pronouns are a complex part of language development. So many kids, autistic or not, go through a phase of pronoun reversals as they're grasping that concept. But in autistic children, pronoun reversal is likely a result of echolalia. If they hear adults referring to them with those pronouns, they may echo that back as it was heard from their perspective. So they're not fully understanding the pronoun's meaning as a single word, a single unit yet. And this is a sign that the child may be a Gestalt language processor.
I'm so glad you said that because, like I said, over the years, I can still think of my 30-year-old friend who was my first kindergartner. He used to, when he was upset, he'd say, "But he wants to." And he still sometimes will have that in his speech. So he likes to, when he comes over, he likes to walk around my house and explore and check out on his own the different rooms. And so one day I said, "Where are you?" And all of a sudden he popped out and he goes, "There I am." So same thing. And so for some kids, it probably kind of corrects itself, or you can teach it. In some autistic individuals, it might be long lasting. But for me, it feels like if we understand what they mean, that's kind of the important part of it.
Yes, absolutely. And Gestalt language processors, they are going to demonstrate some differences, but it's really just about the meaning of their communication. Understanding how they learn language is really important in supporting their language and grammar development over the time. So we wouldn't necessarily want to focus on pronouns, I versus you, with these kids, especially if they're in the early stages of their development. We more want to support just building their language, the amount of language they have in their repertoire. And then the grammar comes later down the line.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think Gestalt language processing is something that has been around a long time, but it's had a resurgence now in people actually talking about it and really applying the principles that go with it. So, can you share in a nutshell what Gestalt language processing is?
Yes. So, in a nutshell, because it is
I
complex,
know.
it is a different way of processing language. So it's processing early language and whole strings of sounds or words rather than processing and learning one word at a time. And that's called analytic language processing when you learn one word at a time. So an analytic language processor might learn ball, and they say that single word, ball. Then they add blue ball. Then they add want blue ball, and it builds into a longer sentence. But with our Gestalt language processors, they learn whole strings of sounds, a whole chunk of language as one unit. And then later that unit is broken down into individual words that can be later used flexibly in self-generated sentences, using grammar, all of those important skills down the line. So it's almost like a reversed order of things, but it's totally a natural way of acquiring language. And now that we know about it, these kids who may have been halted in their progress because they were taught um, through an analytic language processing approach. I've just seen such incredible progress after I've learned, because I've only learned about it a few years ago too. So
Mhm.
it's a really powerful thing to understand, and I'm really excited that more and more people are learning about it.
Yeah, and for people like you spreading the word, it's really important. So I thank you for doing that. And I have an example. So I always think of this little student that I had 2 years ago, and she was 3 years old. And she came over and she was sitting by me and she fell off her chair. She was wiggling around a little bit. She fell off and she looked up at me and she goes, "We all fall down." And I was
Yeah.
like, "Yes, we do." Like, it was
Yeah.
so perfect because she's trying to say, "Oh my gosh, I fell," and
Mhm.
she just didn't have the spontaneous speech to come up with that sentence. And she maybe didn't even understand itself what fall means, but she knows that phrase from what is that from? London Bridge is falling down. We all fall down. And it was just the best thing because I think it's so great when kids can apply it to situations like that
Mhm.
and you can really acknowledge it. I know what you're talking about, honey, because that was perfect.
Yes, I love that you said acknowledge. Um, so echolalia or scripts, repeating phrases that a child has heard in their environment from TV, movies, YouTube, a person, that's historically been viewed as meaningless. And if you Google echolalia, the first definition shows meaningless repetition of words spoken by another person. So now we understand it's not meaningless, it is meaningful, it does hold communicative intent a lot of the time. And we acknowledge that as that child's communication, meaningful communication.
Yeah, I'm really glad you pointed that out because I remember back when I started, echolalia was viewed that way. But I think for those people that are in really every day working with autistic kids, you realize really quickly it is not useless. It has meaning, and you figure out pretty quickly what the meaning is. So I'm so glad the word is spreading about that because it's really, really crucial that people understand that.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to go over to a totally different topic, but I've heard you talk about why WH question goals might not be appropriate for Gestalt language processors. Why would that be?
Yes. So WH question goals focus on a child's ability to answer questions beginning with WH, like who, what, when, where, why, how. And those questions typically aim to test a child's comprehension, ability to retrieve the information, and then answer the question. Um, they're not appropriate for early Gestalt language processors because those questions require breaking down language into separate parts to understand the meaning of the question. So GLPs, on the other hand, process language in chunks or wholes. So a question like, what color is the apple, will be challenging for an early GLP to answer because number one, they may have challenges understanding what information is being asked for and then formulating a response with a single word unit.
Mhm.
And we often see that that child may repeat the question back as a whole. And,
Yep.
I see WH questions, I see yes, no questions by well-intentioned SLPs or other therapists. Because if a child isn't answering those questions, the intuition is to support them with answering and building that skill. But we really want to just focus on modeling meaningful phrases in context for the child to hopefully pick up as a gestalt and then later break down into single words.
Mm. That's a great explanation. And I have written so many WH question goals, yes, no,
Mhm.
pronouns over the years. And so I think when people learn about the stages of Gestalt language processing and they learn about those early stages, it's going to take the pressure off of you as a therapist to have to work on these goals that are just not right at the moment for that child. Thus, you're not going to make progress on them. And I think I have another little example of this same little girl from a couple of years ago. She just showed it so clearly, all these different things that we're talking about. But even something for her, like, what does the cow say, was too much. She couldn't um, come up with, it's not that she didn't know what cows said, but processing that WH question was really difficult. And so for her, switching over to something like, she loved the song Mommy Finger, Where Are You?" And so she would sing that all the time. Well, one day I saw her put these little animals on her fingers, and she would go like, cow finger, where are you? Here I am." And I'm like, okay, she knows how to label cow. So if I was asking her, what is it? And holding up a cow, she was not able to label that. But she knew what a cow was. So we just started doing everything that way. And she could show us what she already knew. And then we could model maybe any animal she didn't know. And it was super fun for her because it was in this song that she loved.
Yes, that's a great example. And, it's not to say that GLPs won't be able to answer questions from NLA stage 4 and later. Individuals can answer WH questions. They have, that ability to know the single word and then self-generate sentences. So it's just about supporting a child where they are in that moment. And if they're repeating the question back, then they're not ready yet for that goal.
That is a perfect way to say it. If they're repeating the question back, because we hear that so much, like, what's your name? What's your name? If they're doing that, they're not ready for a WH question at
Right.
this point.
Exactly.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, next topic. Can you speak to modeling AAC without expectation? Because we're hearing that a lot more. And I think this also frees educators and therapists up to being more in the moment and natural with kids. So, what does it mean to model AAC without expectation?
Yes, that's a great way to say it, being in the moment and natural. So, part of being neurodiversity affirming is supporting honoring multimodal communication. So just putting that out there. And
Mhm,
then traditionally with AAC, we saw a lot of, compliance-based methods. So that might be, say this before you get the preferred item or activity. So we would withhold an object until the person uses their AAC to request, or maybe hand over hand prompting, taking physically guiding the person's hand to select a button or symbol. But these approaches we've just learned are not the best approaches. They're not very neurodiversity affirming. They're not respecting bodily autonomy, and it's kind of putting words in someone's mouth because that AAC is their voice. So yeah, approaches like that with drilling, overcorrecting, just general pressure to talk. And there is pressure on the therapist or the parent and the child. So what modeling AAC without expectation means is just demonstrating the AAC system's capabilities in a relaxed, natural way without pressuring the child to use it right away. So it's just like talking to a friend and naturally, talking about things through the AAC. And this just exposure helps the individual understand how, oh my gosh, mom or Emily's using AAC to communicate. Over time, it builds this confidence and this positive relationship with the AAC. And so yeah, it's just so much better for both. I like how you said that, both the therapist or the adult and the child. And over time, you see kids gain confidence and use it themselves.
I love to think of it too like you're narrating. You're helping narrate what they're doing or, what's going on. And I think a lot of people in the past maybe thought, well, if I model, they're not going to know how to do it. They're not paying attention or whatever. But it seems that over the years now, that's kind of been debunked a little bit. Like
Mhm.
people see modeling is okay. And same thing, the other thing I see and hear a lot is like, "Oh, they're just pushing this button and that button," but I've heard it equated now to babbling. They're playing with their words, and I love that too because it makes you feel like it's okay. I don't need to be on them all the time. And when you talk to Emily about WH questions, I think of one of the first things people do is say, "Okay, what color is this? Show me on your talker."
Mhm.
And we're really directing them, but then we're also asking a WH question for kids that might not understand that yet. And I think we've all been there.
Yeah.
Uh, but when
Oh,
we know better, we do better. And I think that's why it's important to have someone like you on the show, because some people might be just discovering neurodiversity affirming approaches. So I'm glad
yeah.
to have you here.
Oh, thank you. And yes, I love the when you know better, you do better. There is no um shame around using those approaches that I mentioned. I used them.
Mhm.
I and now I call myself the anti-affirming SLP. I'm always learning. I'm sure there's things I'm doing now that is not fully neurodiversity affirming, but it's just about learning. Um, just yeah, taking the posture of learning and adjusting as more information is out there.
Well, and for someone like me that's been in the field for 25 years and learned and used all kinds of approaches because at the time that was cutting edge, innovative. But having putting your pride aside and being open to learning new ways and learning from autistic adults, it's really important, especially if you've been around a long time.
Absolutely.
So, how can we model language during play with our young autistic students? I'm guessing a piece of that would be modeling AAC without expectation. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yes. So that is, yeah, I could have mentioned play during that because it is during play, and that is my approach is child-led play. Play is powerful. It is a child's way of interacting with the world. And when a child or individual is interested, that's the posture that will lead to the most learning. I think about even just myself and my classes when the professor teacher was, having fun and
Mm,
presenting things in a way that I was interested in. I remember that lesson more than if, it wasn't fun for me or, wasn't so we didn't play in college, but you know what I'm saying. So
totally.
during play, we want to follow the child's lead and their interests, observe what captures their attention, pay attention to the toys or activities they're gravitating towards, and then model your language around that.
Mm.
This helps with engagement, that, great moment when you and the child are happy and smiling together. And it reinforces the connection between
Mm.
language and their interests. So get up, I tell parents, let's get down on the child's level. Let's play like we're a kid. And then as you're playing together, just model either on the AAC or spoken language or both. Model that language from the child's perspective, in our own. So we want to avoid, focusing too much on following directions, or avoid saying say, or asking too many questions, right? Like, what's this animal? What does it say? Where does it live? We can label, request, and go beyond that by making comments. That's cool. I like it. Or protesting, no, not that one. Don't want it. Or sharing emotions, I'm excited or I feel sad. So it really is just play and it can
Yeah.
be really uncomfortable at first if you're used to a more traditional approach. But once you get into the groove, you can see just how powerful that play is.
Yeah. And I think sometimes those of us in the schools, one of the things I hear is like, well, yeah, but a therapist is one on one and they can, just do play. I have this whole class of kids, but I recently had a webinar and we talked about this. And I said, we can do play within the structure and routine. So if, we're always having where a child works, maybe with me one on one or a paraprofessional one-on-one. And within that structured area, time, pull out
Mhm.
a couple toys that and have them choose what do they gravitate towards. And then I asked everyone to take this challenge because I heard Serena from Play Spark talk about it
Mhm.
a couple years ago. And she said, I challenge everybody to go into a session or a work session, whatever, and not ask a single question the whole time, whether it's 10 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever. And she's like, it's going to be way harder than you think. And I'm like, I'm going to do that. Okay. So I did it at school and like 30 seconds in, I'm like, oh, oh, nope, don't ask. But then you find yourself narrating, labeling, commenting on what they're doing, and really taking in what they're doing instead of focusing on what you're going to ask next or how you're going to get them to answer you. And that was a really, I think, meaningful and impactful challenge for myself.
Yeah, that's great. And it leads to, I've seen it in my own experience when I stop focusing so much on my little goals, whether it is answering a question or learning this one piece of grammar. I've seen a child show me that they know far beyond what I was even targeting, just stepping into their world and seeing their language during play. Like it is that sweet spot of like we are engaged, we are having fun, and that is when a child can show us what they know. And it's the best place to be for the child to be receptive to new parts of language and communication.
Yeah, because they're comfortable and you're building a positive relationship. And that kind of leads me to the next question. Um, what are some ways that we can focus on prioritizing building connections with our students?
Yes. So focusing on prioritizing regulation, building connections is what I like to call like the base of the pyramid. And then when we have those things, we build on them to support engagement, language, higher level language, cognitive skills. So to do this, we want to first educate ourselves about neurodiversity affirming practices, especially if it's with a neurodivergent student. You mentioned this, listening to lived experiences of autistic neurodivergent individuals. So that's step one. And then we need to understand that specific individual and their unique strengths and support needs. So maybe they have a sensory need or difference, for example. And then their interest, what makes them them. So when we do that, we step into their world, we've built trust, as you've mentioned, the student feels safe, then there's a spark for learning.
Mhm.
And I've seen this with something as simple as a character from, a TV show of one of their scripts, and I integrate that into a session, and there's a connection, and that's only going to build from there. So you do, and I love that you mentioned this too, kind of have to set aside yourself a little bit and really just lean into the child and what
Mhm.
they're interested in.
You know, we've never talked before like this, but one of the things that I am passionate about is using my students' interests to, I like the word you use, spark learning, spark engagement. And I learned this just by figuring it out so many years ago. I was at the elementary level at the time, and I had twins in my class who were both autistic, both non speaking. And I taught them a number of things through country singers because that was their biggest passion, their biggest interest. And one of them was they were second grade, and their mom's like, "Oh, we've just got to get them potty trained because she's like, it's just so expensive and they're getting so big." And so we together were like, let's focus on that. So I made a social story, and it was board maker picture from the waist down with pee going in the potty. And then from the waist up, I cut out pictures of country singers. So we had Willie Nelson pees in the potty and Clint Black pees in the potty. And Emily,
That's
they
so good.
both that day paged through it faster with more attention than I've ever seen them look at anything. And they both peed in the potty that day.
That's amazing.
It's not like we hadn't tried a million things before, but they were like, "Oh, oh, that's what you want. That's what you're asking? Okay."
I love that. I love that story. That's so
Oh,
good.
Willie Nelson saved them from diapers.
And it is true. It's not, I've heard, well, we can't just let them do whatever they want, free for all. We do want to be mindful. It's just pulling pieces from their
Yeah,
interests and then layering in our goals, or, having our goals and layering in their interests. Just as long as it's, part of the picture, then I've seen it myself too.
yeah.
It's so it's a huge shift that happens when you do that.
Mhm.
They're like, "Oh, you okay, now we're talking. You get
Yeah.
me. I can get, I can kind of do this with you now.
Yeah.
Like
And they
it's that.
want to be with you when
Yeah.
you're the one that brings all this goodness. Like these
Yes.
twins, it filtered into everything. So we could do, here's an example, like if you're working on sorting as a pre-academic skill, we can sort Willie Nelson's and Luke Bryan's into
Yeah.
two different baskets. This really happened with them. We thought like OT and us were like, their fine motor muscles are really weak, which, they probably were, but that's probably why they're not tracing their name. Well, their name wasn't meaningful to them. And when I dotted out Willie Nelson, guess who all of a sudden was holding the marker and trying to trace? So
That's
incorporating those interests.
yes, it's everything.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
Okay. Two more things. No, three more things. One of them is the concept of planned ignoring. And I know this came from a behavioral approach, but it's something I think all of us have heard over the years. All of us have been asked to do over the years. Why does planned ignoring not work?
Mhm. So planned ignoring, it's also, I've heard it known as extinction. It is a behavior modification technique and it involves withholding attention from that specific unwanted behavior. And it can and does technically work,
Mhm.
to get rid of a behavior. But just because it works doesn't mean it's the most, ethical or beneficial approach. And it can be really harmful, particularly used with autistic and neurodivergent individuals. And the autistic community has been pretty loud about how harmful it was to them. So, um, the big, my big piece with this is that it seems to misinterpret behavior as solely attention seeking, when instead we want to focus and understand the why of a behavior. So, if a child, I think of, one of my current kiddos. He will, throw himself to the floor. And or he used to more often. And he's also in ABA and they do planned ignoring. Um, and I was thinking, well, does this work? I kind of tried it for a little bit, but then it felt wrong. Do you feel something in your gut
Yes.
sometimes? And so I, got down to the floor and I just sat near him. I could tell he didn't want, me to hug him or talk through. He actually, we found out, needed to he needed to have sensory accommodations. So we actually discovered he had these triggers, and that is what we needed to get rid of to reduce the quote behavior. So it wasn't that he was manipulative or wanting to do this for attention. He was trying to communicate a need. And once that need was met, the behavior went away. So it's so challenging and it is child, specific. But I have found that when we, get to the floor with a child, we offer co-regulation, whether that's involving touch or language or not, then we create a safe and supportive environment and those behaviors go down. I've seen when planned ignoring has been used, the child just feels unheard, not safe, and the behaviors increase. So that is my big it's a sticky subject because it is used and I hear, well, that child, that's what the child needs at the time. The child needs space. We can provide space while also co-regulating and providing a supportive environment.
Yeah. I again, I love the way that you described that. And it made me think of a recent discussion with Casey Ehrlich that she talked about PDA, pathological demand avoidance, and gave some techniques for when you're at that point of there's been a meltdown and what kids need to kind of come back from that. And when you're saying some kids maybe would need touch, like a hug or something like that. And some kids need you to maybe just be sitting down on their level, maybe not even right next to them, and maybe not talking to them, but
Mhm.
they see you as a safe and supportive person. And I think that kind of approach also doesn't erode the trust between you two.
Exactly. And a another area of co-regulation is validation. And I've felt it myself as an adult when I'm not regulated and I'm talking about something that bothers me, and the other person is either dismissing it, like, oh no, it's not a big deal. I feel the energy rise in
Mhm.
my body. But when the person says, you know what, that's really hard, oh my gosh, I'm instantly more regulated. So if you think about that with kids, if we're, not giving the behavior attention, we're, and I know people have argued it's not ignoring the child, it's ignoring the behavior. But if we're not giving the child attention, then they're not feeling heard, they're not feeling validated, and it just might escalate from there. So, another tip that I like to do when I'm, you know, trying to offer support is just speaking out that this is hard. I know this is hard. If it's a GLP, I'm sad, I'm mad. I don't want that. Giving them language, they may not be receptive to it in that dysregulated state, but at least they're hearing that we're hearing that
Yes.
communication, if it is communication, and it often is.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, those are great points when it comes to this. It is a hard subject to talk about. It's a hard subject to know what to do and if you're doing the right thing. The teacher that I co-taught with for 10 years, she would always say, if it feels yucky, let's not do it. And I'm like, yeah. So we always give something the gut check when we're trying a strategy or something new out.
That's so good. That's so good. It does. We need to trust our guts and our
Yeah.
intuition. What feels right, what doesn't feel right. And then yeah, it's trial and error, and we can't expect to be perfect as
Mhm.
therapists or as parents, but as long as we're, you know, actively listening to the community that this child is in, and trying our best, then that's all we can do.
Yeah, definitely. I think along the lines of meltdown, um, one other thing that I've heard talked about recently, more so, is honoring protests from autistic children. And I want to ask you, what does it mean and why is it so important? Because I think this is one people really get hung up on too.
Right. Great point, because a behavior like a meltdown might be a protest,
Mhm.
or it might be a sense, we don't know. But protesting is important, and it's a way for all kids to communicate their dislikes, discomfort, disagreement. And I see focus a lot of the times on requesting or demands, and we just want to make sure that we are, number one, improving a child's language for more than just requesting. And because if we think about the way we adults communicate, we need to be able to request for things, but we also protest. We also, you know, express our likes, dislikes, and language can be really robotic if it's only I want ball,
Mhm.
And so when protest, no matter the modality, it might be spoken protest, it might be non-spoken. are met with understanding and support, then kids learn to express their emotions more constructively. And then they can develop more healthy mechanisms for emotional regulation because they're being heard and validated. It kind of goes back to the validation. And yeah, it provides just control over their environment to make choices, what they want to do and what they don't want to do, and builds autonomy, empowers them.
I agree. And it's such an important part of communication. Like you said, if we couldn't tell anyone no, we were never allowed to say no, or I don't want that, or I don't like that, we would be pretty frustrated all the time. So I think of it and I try to explain it to people like in my membership as at the early childhood level, maybe we need to interpret or pay attention to their multimodal communication. So if I'm giving them a toy that I think they want to play with and they push it away, again, I need to set aside my agenda and acknowledge, like, oh, no, you don't want that? Okay, let's find something else. Or maybe they're walking away from the area and
Mhm.
it's like, well, they're trying to get out of doing blah, blah, blah. Well, they probably are because it's either not interesting, it's not at the right level, they're not motivated by it. So that's communication. So how can we say, acknowledge it, give them a break, and then maybe come back with a couple different things they can choose from where they're probably going to like at least one of the choices, and then re-engage them. And I think if we could do that more, kids would be a lot less frustrated and also feel validated in their attempt to communicate.
Absolutely. And yes, everything you said was so great. It's so important. It's a big piece of our communication.
Mhm.
Um, and there's some approaches that do target tolerance of non-preferred or disliked activities. Um, and while this might be important in some areas of life as a child, we need to build self-advocacy. We need to build communication. So if a child is communicating, even just those ways that you talked about, pushing a hand away, walking away, and it's not being responded to, then that's not very encouraging for the child to learn more communication if they're not being listened to. And it can lead to kids masking true feelings and preferences, and just, yeah, we don't really know how to support them if we don't understand, um, what is and isn't comfortable for them, what is or isn't an interest for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I always point out, of course, we're not going to say, okay, if they're like, I want to run in the street or, there's common sense here and safety. But when there are opportunities to acknowledge a protest and accept that, it's a great way to help them build different ways to communicate, like you said, versus just learning. I use communication to request.
Mhm.
So
Exactly.
good, good.
Uh,
So one last question, and we've talked about this throughout, but in a nutshell, what does it mean to be neurodiversity affirming?
So it means a lot of things, and I'm learning all the time, even more that it means. But to try to summarize, it means that we understand that there is natural diversity of the human brain, and no type of brain function is right or better than the other. All people deserve rights, equality, and inclusion, regardless of neurological differences. And, neurodivergent people are not broken or incomplete versions of neurotypical people. It's just a different way of being human, as Dr. Barry Prezant
Mhm.
says. So if you think about just the word of neurodiversity affirming, we affirm those variations, and then we listen. We listen and continuously learn to autistic and neurodivergent individuals, so that we can support them in the way that feels best to them, and in a way that can create these skills, communication, in the way that feels most authentic to them.
Mhm.
Um, and again, there's no shame if we've had an approach previously that we don't agree with now, but as you said, when we know better, we do better.
Yeah, and it's baby steps. It's for some people like taking one little piece at a time of one of the things you heard us talk about today and implementing that. And then when you're comfortable there and you have your team on board, then another one. So it doesn't have to be overnight. It's hard to change anything you're doing overnight, and it takes practice. So you so eloquently explained all of these things, Emily, and I can't thank you enough for being here.
Thank you so much. This was so fun. And it just means a lot to be able to advocate for some of these things. And yeah, this was a lot of fun. So thank you.
Awesome. Where can everybody find you? Because I keep talking about your Instagram. So where can they find you?
That is the only place right now.
All right,
It's at
perfect.
or at ND Affirming SLP. I do have some exciting things coming. Uh,
Ooh.
a website will be coming along with some other opportunities to work with me. But yeah, right now just follow along with my Instagram and I'll post updates there.
Yeah, you'll get to be the first to know if you go follow her now. So I'll put that in the show notes, and I encourage everybody to go follow Emily 'cause she has some of the best reels that are going to give you these little tidbits, these little baby steps that you can take to become more neurodiversity affirming yourself. So thank you again for being here, Emily. It was lovely.
Yes, so good talking to you, and we will stay connected for sure.
Definitely, definitely. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.